I'm speaking right now to every idealistic person who supported Bernie Sanders in 2017 and 2020. You know things are bad in this country. You think about climate change and the working class. You know people have it bad in America right now. You know this planet is getting more and more screwed up by global capitalism every year. Millennials are the largest share of the workforce in this country, 72 million people, yet we control only 4% of US wealth. And for all the wealth that 72 million people have, one out of every $40 is owned by just 3 individuals, the heir to the Walmart fortune, and Facebook founders Mark Zuckerberg and Dustin Moskovitz. The richest 50 people in America right now have as much money as the 165 million others on the bottom. Over the last 50 years, productivity soared while wages stagnated. In other words, all the wealth has gone to the top. The coronavirus pandemic accelerated this trend of huge monopolies crushing small businesses, concentrating even more wealth at the top. In a year when people are dealing with constant money worries, losing their jobs, losing their homes, the CEO of Amazon made $13 billion in a single day. At the same time, we're in the middle of a worldwide environmental catastrophe created by liberal capitalism. A new report by the World Wildlife Fund and the London Zoological Society details how nature is declining globally at rates unprecedented in millions of years. Just a few examples. Since 1970, populations of all classes of species, including mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and fish, plummeted 68% since 1970. In the rainforests of Central and South America, there has been a 94% decline in species under observation. Freshwater species populations have declined by 84%, and 1 in 3 freshwater species are facing extinction. Over the past century, animals are disappearing at a rate about 100 times faster than they used to. This goes from the largest animals, who depend on complex ecosystems to survive, down to the honeybees and the butterflies, which are disappearing in record numbers. I was born in the early 80s. I remember growing up, you used to see a lot more honeybees, butterflies than you see today. And I'm sure many of you know what I'm talking about. But in the last few years, lobbyists in the so-called green energy industry have made climate change into a marketing slogan, where all environmental problems can be reduced to the simple formula of carbon emissions. A fantasy is presented that if we just build enough wind turbines and solar panels, we can continue with business as usual. We don't really hear anymore about pollution, about deforestation, habitat degradation, overexploitation, or urban sprawl. It's just climate change. That's all we hear, and carbon emissions. We are told that if we just give more subsidies to this one branch of the energy industry, that it will solve all our problems. Of course, many environmentalists know better. They know globalization is the problem, the liberal capitalist hunger for endless economic growth fueled by debt. The most direct driver of the destruction in recent decades has been land use change. Pristine habitats like forests and grasslands turned into agricultural systems, and also the overfishing of the ocean. You can't buy your way out of this with tax giveaways for the lobbyists to the energy industry. But on the other hand, you can't really say this in leftist circles. Overpopulation has become a racist term. White privilege. It's easy to understand why. In the year 1900, there were about 1.6 billion people on the planet, 120 years ago. We're now at 7.5 billion, and that's expected to jump to 10 billion by 2050. Yet, in the year 1900, Europe had a quarter of the world's population, which was at the time 3 times the population of Africa. By 2050, Europe is projected to have gone down to just 7% of the world population, which will at that time be 1/3 that of Africa. We've got the same problem with labor. Globalization created a race to the bottom and forced Americans to compete with third world workers. This has also led to labor market concentration, with a smaller number of large companies providing all employment. You guys know what I'm talking about. It's just more and more monopolies. Immigration has transformed this country since the 1970s, the exact time frame when wages stagnated and unions declined. Yet if you point out the connection, you're a racist. Just like outsourcing, mass immigration reduces wages because people from countries with low standards of living will do for a lot more for a lot less. This isn't rocket science. Everybody knows why it happens. This is the whole point of immigration. Every wave of immigration brought into the US from the big capitalists has been for this reason. It's the same logic that brought the slaves here from Africa hundreds of years ago. You think those plantation owners wanted slaves for cultural enrichment or to increase diversity? They weren't seeing rainbows, they were seeing dollar signs. And it's the same reason why we have immigration today. We hear all the time about diversity, but along with all the other problems that diversity brings, such as lower social trust, diversity also makes a workforce easier to control. Diversity increases productivity for the top because it breaks down rooted communities, makes it harder for people to organize because they have less in common with each other, and it makes the cost of labor go down by simply expanding the labor pool. Again, this is simple math. There are now almost 50 million foreign-born people living in the United States. That's more immigrants than any country in the world and at any time in American history. In the fields of tech, construction, healthcare, agriculture, transportation, and many others, all this has been to drive down wages for the workers and drive up profits for the capitalists. That's it. It's scab labor. The robber barons knew this, so do the big corporations today. This is so obvious, everyone knows it. It's by design. Yet if you speak about it, you're shunned, deplatformed, shut out of the conversation. So the question is, how did they convince the left? How did they convince the left, which supposedly cares about labor and the environment? How did they convince the left to take up the cause of abolishing ICE and increasing immigration? The same way they got the left to sign on to the globalization which is destroying our planet with bullshit slogans about human rights, diversity, multiculturalism, anti-racism, and so on. Which are incidentally the same slogans used to justify America's unjust, immoral wars. Instead of leftists speaking up, the opposite is happening. Recently, a corpulent neoliberal Jew by the name of Matthew Yglesias, one of the co-founders of Vox, with a very high, squeaky voice, called for increasing the United States population. He wrote a book called 1 Billion Americans. He called for increasing the United States population by 650 million people, mostly through immigration. About 3 times our current population, all in the name of economic growth. The reason this totally insane plan wasn't condemned as labor and ecological suicide by all quarters is very simple. It's because the left is in bed with neoliberalism. Diversity, multiculturalism are slogans used by global corporations and their idiot puppets to justify mass displacement and destruction of human communities, cultures, nations, and ecosystems. Human communities are ecosystems too, in that it takes time for culture, traditions, and patterns of life to grow and develop. The characteristic of big capital is that it disrupts these patterns for economic growth. And the people see only a fraction of this growth, and it's at a cost that's not worth it. The real growth goes only to the top. Immigration is also devastating to the environment. The Sierra Club used to be 100% against it until another rich Jew, David Gelbaum, bought them out with a $100 million donation in 2004. He ended up giving the Sierra Club over $250 million on the one condition that they drop their stance against immigration. The organization's founders The founders of the Sierra Club were pushed out over this issue of their own organization. So, you Bernie supporters, look at what happened to you in the last 4 years. You had a guy who came along who promised a revolution against the establishment. But what did he end up doing? Both in 2016 and again in 2020, he ended up redirecting all your effort, your energy, and your sacrifice into supporting two of the worst neoliberals of all time. During an era when household debts skyrocketed, Joe Biden advanced his whole career by being a tool of the credit card industry and also a big supporter of the Iraq War. Kamala Harris is entirely a creature of Jew finance and big tech without any principles whatsoever. All that burning energy, the DSA and the Jacobin, this so-called democratic socialism, all to put two of the most rotten capitalists in the country in power. We need a political revolution in this country. You're not going to get that from your fake democratic socialism. You think you're going to change? You think you're going to change the Democratic Party from within? Kamala Harris didn't even get a single vote. She dropped out of the primary after one gentle nudge by Tulsi Gabbard in the debates. And yet, without getting a single vote, the neoliberal system anointed Kamala Harris their chosen one, and Kamala Harris will be our president. And you'll be told to shut up about it, or you're a racist, opposing the historic achievement of a black woman ruling from the White House. The Democrats even resorted to blocking the Green Party from ballot access in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. This is something I just found out about. And I know a thing or two about ballot access petitioning. It's very hard. The Green Party struggled, but they did it. They got thousands of citizens in Pennsylvania to sign petitions to have the Green Party presidential candidate appear on the ballot. They got enough signatures, but because of Democratic Party lawyers and a legal technicality and a bad ruling by partisan Democrats on the state Supreme Court, the Green Party was struck from the ballot. Even though they had enough signatures to qualify. In Wisconsin, the same thing. A Democratic Party lawyer filed another challenge to get the Green Party stripped off the ballot because of a legal technicality. So this is what democratic socialism looks like. Using big money power and legal trickery to disenfranchise the voters who care most about labor and the environment. You Bernie voters, you probably don't want to hear what I have to say because your masters will tell you that I'm a white supremacist. And you're not allowed to talk to me.
They're Jewish supremacists.
Well, white supremacist, what does that even mean? I hate injustice. I hate greed. I hate parasites who destroy nature and nations for money and power. My people, the white Europeans, are dear to me as my own family. But hating someone just because they belong to another people is as irrational to me as hating someone because they belong to another family. Is it so strange that some white people who don't want to see species wiped out, ecosystems destroyed, or indigenous cultures erased by global consumerism and commercialism might also want the same for white people? Is that so strange? Because believe it or not, that's all white nationalism is. That's all white nationalism is. Your neoliberal masters are lying to you again. The truth is that what you've been sold as democratic socialism is neoliberal capitalism with some dressing. Some more tax giveaways to the green energy marketing scam, and some small scraps thrown to the victims in the form of welfare payments. Your leaders have no intention of overthrowing the system. They are there to keep the system going. My message to the left is, get your head out of your ass. Look at what is happening to your planet. Look at what's happening to your planet. Look at what's happening to your people. Look at these scumbag liars in the DSA, at the Jacobin, in the Bernie movement, who conned you into voting first for Hillary Clinton, then for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Look at the rich Jews funding your organizations and your political candidates. You think that a party led by a man like Chuck Schumer, the biggest friend to Wall Street in the Senate, is going to help the workers or save the planet? Come on! Join us! Join the real resistance. Stop being led around. Stop being led around by the nose. Our movement is filled. Our movement is filled with former leftists. We hate injustice as much as you do. We don't want working people anywhere, of any race, to be exploited. We love nature and we want to preserve it. Not just for some materialistic bottom line, but for its own sake. We are not funded by any globalist NGOs. We're the real threat to this neoliberal system. So get with us, get with the real fight against these pigs, or get back in bed with Kamala and Wall Street.